I've got a pretty generic title for my presentation because it's my favourite title. I've used it time and again. I've named the whole seminar series in Paris 1 after that, and I keep using it, Political Economy and Institutional Change, because I like it. So it's pretty generic, but I hope that you will see what I mean by that. My presentation is going to be separated into two components. The first one is going to present some general theoretical framework, not a theory per se, just to give you an idea of the way to analyze the things I want to analyze. And the second part, be more applied, be dedicated to analysing the case of France in the last decades, because, well, it's what I've worked on recently, so I've got a better idea of what is going on. So regarding my theoretical ideas, what should political economy of institutions and institutional change be, or at least what elements should it include? Just to give you another idea of the background, of the context, is that I've worked on comparative capitalism, like, you know, these sort of varieties of capitalism, all Soskis, etc., etc. And I'm not, I mean, I like David Soskis and Peter Hall, but I'm not particularly fond of the variety of capitalism approach for some reasons which I think will be clear as long as I explain what I want to do. And in particular, comparative capitalism has been criticised by other scholars of capitalism for being too static and explaining things in equilibrium which never change, etc. And that's one of the standard critique addressed to comparative capitalism. I want to show that it's not necessarily so that you can have comparative capitalism analysis which are not bound to be static or in equilibrium. So elements of a political economy of institutions and institutional change. We should have, if not a theory, at least a theoretical framework in order to analyze those things. I mean, it may sound like trite, but comparative capitalism studies, if you know a bit of the literature, is affected by what I call inductive theorizing. Like, you analyze inductively some cases and then you generalize the ideas which you've inductively discovered, and you make a theory out of it. And it also is a consequence of having the analysis presented as a narrative. So a narrative is like, you know, you tell a story, and the story is like you know, you've got many crosses and turns, etc. And your narrative is just following every crossing, every turn of reality, of history, and then you say you've got a theory explaining everything. So I mean, basically, we've got two pitfalls to avoid. The first one is this sort of descriptive theorizing, right? And the second pitfall is, of course, the one which is most experienced by economists, which is to have some sort of theory which is applied to everything everywhere. Like, you know, you've got a theory of individual behavior, and with your theory of individual behavior, you're able to explain the behavior of actors on the financial markets, as well as, you know, the story of ancient Egypt or something like this, the history of ancient Egypt. Also, it's important to know what an institution is. Again, you would be surprised if you don't know institutional economics well enough. You'd be surprised by the number of people who actually do institutional economics who are not able to produce a definition of institutions. And I suppose that Veblen is to blame for that, because it was his approach. But sometimes you hear scholars talk about institutional change, and what they mean actually is a change in the strategy of unions, employers' organizations, etc. So a change of strategy for them is a change in institutional change, whereas, you know, no institution has been changed. It's simply that some agents have decided to change their strategies. Why is it important? Well, because if you define a model by its institutions, if you want to know if a model has changed, if there is a change in a model, in a variety of capitalism, for instance, then you've got to assess what institutional change is, and in order to assess what institutional change is, you need to have a definition, at least a theory of institutions. Something which is not so evident for economists, but evident for other social scientists, which is not to have a normative, even implicitly, not to have a normative approach, but a positive approach. Economists, of course, are fond of telling what is good and what is right and what is the right policy, etc., etc. This is a thing which should be avoided. Also, something which is not common among economists is to link the political, the social, and the economic dynamics, which means that it's not possible to analyze change in capitalism by limiting itself to simply the economic realm. And it's something I go back to later on. And also important, comparative capitalism is fond of typologies, and it's important to go beyond the simple definition of typologies, you know, this model is like this other variety is like that, etc. And to go beyond the question of the forms, which means the type of capitalism, but to explain when it changes, why it changes, and what is behind, which is exactly why we need to address the problems linking political, social, and economic dynamics. So very rapidly, several levels, without being exhaustive, of course, but at least you know, sort of minimum requirements, several levels to distinguish. The idea of ideology and representations, which is not limited to discourse. You've got many studies of discourse in comparative capitalism, but it's not simply that. I'll tell you why it is important. It is important because I'll come back to that later when I talk about ideas and interests. But the second problem is the demands, the expectations, the preferences of the different agents, of social actors, etc., and the strategies they are going to implement, to adopt in order to have their demands satisfied. Political mediation, meaning the political actor, so you know the institutions change usually through the action of political actors, especially formal institutions. So it's important to have in the picture the political strategies. Also important, and I come back to that later on, the social groups which are either supporting or not supporting the current institutional configurations. So to say it bluntly, who is happy with the state of the institutions of the model in the current situation, and who is unhappy with it, and who can do something about it, and who can't. And of course institutions, so institutions which be defined very classically as social rules and not as behavior, but I've talked about that already. The approach which I want to present and which I adopt is a conflict-based approach. And the origins are to be found in the theory of regulation, and before that, of course, in Marx and in other conflict, in other scholars who have insisted on social conflict, which means it's a break with economic functionalism. So I mean, a model doesn't exist because it is economically efficient. It exists and it is stable because it has regulated conflict, social conflict. Of course, the regulation of social conflict is influenced by economic performance, so to speak, macroeconomic performance, but it's not reducible to economic performance. So I mean, it's a radical break with the sort of economic functionalism which you find in actually many studies of comparative capitalism. First of all, varieties of capitalism, where you know basically you've got two different varieties, LMEs, CMEs, and they exist because they're equally competitive in their representation. So, and social conflict, again, this is something which I was not, until recently I'd forgotten that, because I'd read Aglieta's book, the first book of Aglieta in the 1980s when I was a student, and I'd forgotten about it, but it's very clear in the introduction to his book on the USA, when he says that social conflict cannot be abolished. It can be regulated, meaning temporarily neutralized, but it's always there. And it can reappear and become more active precisely in situations of crisis. So some characteristics which actually are very close to the original theory of regulation. Logical provenance of crisis. You know, like regulation, for instance, is insisting on what is to be explained is stability, not crisis. Crisis is in the normal situation. So you want to explain why there is no crisis and why there is not why there is a crisis. Regarding institutions, also another break with functionalism is to say that the genesis, the emergence of an institution is not the explanation of the genesis of an institution or a series of institutions is not reducible to the function that an institution has or a series of institutions have in the social structure. So the question of genesis and functioning of institutions is they're two different separate things, which again is something which is not traditional in economics, where you explain institutions because there is, you know, market failure. There is a market failure, so you need an institution to solve the problem, etc. Of course, the bottom line being, as I've said previously, you appreciate the viability of a model of capitalism, of the social configuration, of the social structure, whatever, by its political and social stability, not by its economic performance. A series of notions which I use very simply, the idea of precisely when the social conflict is regulated. I've used, and my co-authors and I, we've used this sometimes this idea of political equilibrium, which is a bit of a dangerous term because in economics it's used in a certain, equilibrium is used in a precise way, and the way other social scientists misunderstand sometimes this notion of equilibrium is they understand equilibrium as something which is static, something which doesn't move. Whereas, as you know, you can have dynamic equilibria, you can have equilibriums which are chaotic dynamics. That can be an equilibrium, for instance. It doesn't mean that it doesn't move, it means it moves quite widely, actually. So it's probably not a good term to use, and in retrospect, I shouldn't have used the notion of equilibrium. If you're vaguely familiar with some notions of other mathematical theories, there's another notion which would have been better, which was this idea of viability. The idea that you've got a system which is viable when it doesn't cross over some boundaries which define its domain of validity. It's probably a better notion than an equilibrium. So anyway, you've got a political equilibrium when social conflict and political conflict is regulated, and when there is an existence of something which my co-author Stefano Palambarini and I have called it a dominant social bloc, and I'll come back to the definition later on. A dominant social bloc is a block of social groups which validate or support the dominant political strategy, and the dominant political strategy, of course, is sustaining the particular model of capitalism existing at one moment. And a crisis, a political crisis, is defined as the breakup of the dominant social bloc, and it means that it's not possible for political mediation to find a solution to the conflicts within the dominant social bloc. Okay. The third notion, which is important for the analysis of the current situation in some countries, such as France, is this idea of systemic crisis. And a systemic crisis is when it is not possible to find a strategy of institutional change that would aggregate a new dominant social bloc. It's a situation where you've got contestation of the model, but you've got no alternative solution ready-made for another type of model which would be backed by a sufficient number of social groups, a sufficient social and political majority which would validate the new model. Well, I don't want to be too long on that, so I'll skip this. I'll skip this as well. I mean, there's no need to be too long on that. Other notions. which are one notion which is common in comparative capitalism, which is institutional complementarity, and another notion which is more specific to regulation and to what I've tried to do is this idea of institutional hierarchy. So institutional complementarity is very simple to understand. It means that you've got certain institutions, when coupled together, which produce a result which is more than the sum of its parts. So it's basically applied to the institutional economics, this idea of complementarity, which you find, for instance, in production theory, in traditional economics, etc., etc. And you've got many contributions on that. Masahiko Aoki was probably the first one when he explained to contribute to that, when he explained, you know, this the difference between the J firm and the A firm, the archetypal Japanese firm, the archetypal American firm, explaining that the internal organization of the Japanese firm was actually complementary with the type of financial system that existed in Japan with the main bank, etc., etc. And the same story, but completely different, but the same logic could be told about the American firm. And this idea has been applied to many institutions by a variety of people. It's been picked up by Hall and Soskis in their variety of capitalism. Why is it important for comparative capitalism? Because it says in a very simple way that you've got no one best way, like you've got no one best model, but you've got alternatively not every combination of institutions which is possible. Like you can't have, I don't know, the social protection system of Sweden with the fiscal system of the US, for instance. You know, it's not possible for obvious reasons. They've got some more sophisticated complementarities which you can think of, but it's this idea. It was present in regulation theory, and again, it's important to understand that it's not something which is complementarity is usually not complementarity by design. It's more complementarity by chance, because those institutions are inherited from history. Those institutions are the outcome of some social conflict and social compromises which are made at one historical moment, and the idea that it would be complementary with another type of institutions which has emerged for a totally different logic at a totally different period is, of course, something which is ludicrous. So, I mean, the complementarity appears ex post, and it's an idea which is much present in the theory of regulation very early. And this is different from other types of institutional complementarities which you may find in the literature. I mean, even Aoki is probably very functionalist in his explanation. And certainly Hall and Soskis are very functionalist in their explanation of complementarities. But this is not the case for regulation. So you see, yeah, it's something which is in Boyer when he says that the institutional configuration which prevailed in the post-war period was surprisingly efficient. You know, not efficient by design, but surprisingly efficient because it was the combination of institutions which had not been designed in order to be complementary and efficient from a macroeconomic point of view. Institutional change. So you've got this idea of complementarity, like, you know, several parts fit well together, and it seems to be something which is hostile to the idea of change, because if it fits so well together, why would it change, right? So sometimes some critiques of institutional complementarity say it is too functionalist, so it's a part of address, and it is too efficient and it is too static, because if it works perfectly well, there's no reason to change them. But actually, institutional complementarity is a thing which may work in reverse. Like if something which fits well with another institution is changed, it means that it is not going to fit well, and it is going to provoke some further institutional change. So it's like exactly the same mechanism which made some institutions complementary with one another. They can be precisely not complementary with one another, and one local change may actually set off a series of further change which are going to lead to a change of model altogether. So complementarity actually can work both ways, and beyond a certain degree of change in an institution, the complementarities are questioned, which means that actually the stability of the whole model is questioned itself. So there's the idea, okay, so but if institutions, if you've got some institutions complementarity in the system, why would agents want to change institutions? Because it seems to work, so the institutions fit more or less perfectly with one another, so why would there be a change? And then, in a functionalist explanation, there is no reason for that. But in a political economy explanation, you can say, well, actually institutions are local compromises. They're compromises of a local conflict. So, I mean, and the conflict is always present, which means that the forces which would want a change in institutions are always present. So there's a possibility that in a certain historical situation, on a certain part of the system, you've got some actors which are actually powerful enough in order to set off a change, and this change may have consequences precisely with those institutional complementarity working in reverse. So you may find a situation where you've got, for instance, if you think in simple terms like, you know, liberal model versus non-liberal model, you may very well have a system where some parts of the system have been liberalized and other parts of the system have not been liberalized, and it may or may not be complementary, depending on the situation, which is why in the literature you've got this notion of hybridization. You know, you've got models which are hybrid of pure models, and the question is, if you believe in institutional complementarity, how is it possible that hybrid models work? So you've got a good explanation, a bad explanation, which is to say, well, there is some slack in the model, you know, it's not tightly linked, etc., which is, you know, some sort of ad hoc type of explanation. And you've got, I think, a far better explanation, which is to say, well, actually, the complementarities are not functionalist, the complementarities are more political. And it is a political economy definition of complementarity. So the complementarity mustn't be appreciated by its pure economic performance, by the fact that it contributes to the regulation of social conflict. So let me, for instance, give you an example. In the traditional variety of capitalism, complementarity in a variety is by the fact that everything is coordinated or everything is liberal. So if you've got, for instance, a liberalized social protection system with a coordinated wage bargaining system, it seems that it is not complementary from the point of view of variety of capitalism. But if you think in terms of political economy, you may well say that you may have a combination of social groups. You may have a dominant social bloc which is composed of groups where you've got some groups which insist on a liberalized social protection system and other groups that insist on a coordinated wage bargaining system. Okay? So, I mean, again, if this works politically, then it is stable and it is complementary with the two types of institutions, the liberalized ones and the coordinated ones, are actually complementary with one another. Complementary with respect to what? With respect that they produce political regulation of the social conflict and they produce political stability. And of course, this idea of a political economy complementarity, it leads to different types of complementarities than the complementarities which are, you know, strictly economic efficiency usually, which you find in the literature. I'm going fast because I want to talk about I want more to talk about the applied part than about the theory part. The other notion which is important is this notion of hierarchy, and this you find it more specifically in regulation and not very much anywhere else, at least not in institutional economics. This idea is that social groups have got demands, preferences, expectations, whatever you may want to call it, but some are more important than others. And there is a hierarchy for social groups, a hierarchy of institutional features that they would want to see implemented or adopted. So the most important institutions or the most important institutional changes are on top of the hierarchy, and some of the demands may not be so important. So you can have a definition of hierarchy of institutions for the social groups themselves, like, employers think that the most important thing is to have a liberalized labor market. Then they would want a liberalized social protection market. And then they don't care about the liberalized, I don't know, kindergarten or whatever. They've got things which are not so important. And it's the same for other groups, but of course it's a different hierarchy and different type of demand. And you've got a hierarchy for the political actors, for the government, for instance, where the most important institutions, the ones that are on top of the hierarchy, are the ones which preserve their political stability, which means the ones that preserve the stability of the dominant social group, the social bloc, meaning this aggregation of groups which support the dominant political strategy. Why is it important? It will become important, this notion, when I talk about institutional change in France and the ways it's operated in the past decade. Because the notion of hierarchy explains well what took place in terms of change. So very rapidly, so political economy of institutions and institutional change. It's not simply economics and it's not simply politics. It's a bit of both. In order to analyze comparative capitalism and the evolution of comparative capitalism, you need to take into account at least a minimum set of elements which are here the socio-economic models, meaning the set of institutions that define a particular variety of capitalism, identify the dominant social bloc, who has got an interest in the stability of the system, the political actors, what are the strategies which aggregate, stabilize the dominant social bloc, and of course the economic policy, for instance, the short-term macroeconomic policy, which regulates, in a way, social conflict within a given socio-economic model. So all these elements have been applied by me, either alone or with my co-author, different co-authors, Elvire Guillot or Stefano Palambarini, to a comparison between France and Italy, and more specifically to the evolution of France over several decades in a few contributions. Like, for instance, in those contributions, we've got a couple of elements, a couple of books which are strictly in French. There is a German translation which should appear later this autumn, and I'm going to talk about France, and I base myself mostly on the book Structural Crisis and Institutional Change in Modern Capitalism, which was published last year, which is an analysis of France. So, in a nutshell, the story that could be told for France as well as for a few other economies is the following. You had a certain stability in the post-war period of the socio-economic model. The economic dynamics of the 1970s, after the crisis of the 1970s, and 1980s, the institutional change which were implemented in the crisis period, made the dominant socio-political compromises more fragile, which set off a series of institutional change which themselves made the situation more fragile. Meaning we are, for certain countries, and for France certainly, in a situation of systemic crisis, where the old model is no longer sustained by a stable dominant social bloc, but the institutional change strategies implemented by political actors are unable to find the sufficient social support. And for France, for instance, you see that the different political actors have tried to implement changes in one direction or another, so in a radical neoliberal direction or in a radical social democratic direction, and both these political strategies have failed, okay, which explains why France is and Italy also probably is a hybrid model, which is the result of the series of institutional change which have been implemented since the 1970s. So it's a hybrid model. Could a hybrid model be a stable model? Again, if you think in terms of political economy complementarity, it's quite possible. But precisely we are in a situation of systemic crisis, meaning that, well, no, it's not stable, because there is not yet a stable dominant social bloc which would validate this hybrid model. Yeah, this is not going into details. So French capitalism since the 1980s, for instance, since the first neoliberal reforms have been implemented, has been a hybrid model. Again, in a nutshell, the story, France is not a neoliberal model. It's not what Holland-Soskis would call an LME, a liberal market economy, because it still has those institutions inherited from the post-war period which are not liberal. But sections of the model, parts of the model, have been liberalized quite radically and are being liberalized quite radically exactly at this moment, literally. What happened in France is that since the 1980s, since the beginning of the 1980s, you had two different political strategies which have been implemented. And these political strategies have liberalized the economy. But they've liberalized the economy in a different way each time they were in power. So you've got two political alliances. You've got social democratic, socialist one, and a left political alliance, and you had a right political alliance. And since the 1980s, the left and the right have been alternating in power, with losing the power at one election, gaining power at the next election, etc., etc. So it's a good example of a country which experienced almost permanent political change, left-right alternating in power, and of course those governments implementing different types of reforms and neoliberal reforms. And what is interesting is that the left was in power because it was backed by a left dominant social bloc. And on top of this dominant social bloc of the left, you had institutions of institutional hierarchy. You had the institutions of social protection and the labor market. So when the left was in power, the neoliberal reforms it implemented were everywhere except in social protection and in the labor market. For one reason, obviously, because those areas were extremely important for the stability of their dominant social bloc, their social alliances. When the right was in power, the situation was different, of course, because their bloc, their support, their social support, had a different hierarchy of institutions. So when they were in power, actually what they neoliberalized, or what they liberalized, were precisely, timidly, social protection and the labor market. Okay. So you've got the evolution of the French system being liberalized everywhere except in social protection and the labor market when the left was in power. And when the right was in power, they would precisely attack those institutions which the left had left intact. And it's a question, of course, of making perfect sense from a political point of view. You don't want to destroy the stability of your social base, okay? Except the socialists, of course, the left, which in the end decided that, no, they wanted to change their social support, and they wanted to have a different type of dominant social bloc. Let me briefly, I suppose, go back in history and explain something about the evolution of France, which is not always understood when you read about France, and which probably applies to other countries as well, but specifically for France. I focused on the evolution since the 1980s. And of course, everybody thinks, oh yeah, the 1980s, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, the Conservative Revolution and stuff like that. The point I want to make, and the point I won't make in more details in the various books I've shown, is that it's at best a partial explanation for the evolution of France, for what took place in France. Actually, neoliberalism is more ancient in France than the appearance of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. You've got, so to say, a tradition of neoliberalism in France. And you could even say that neoliberalism was born in France because the founding moment for neoliberalism was this conference organized in 1938, you know, the famous colloque Lickman, conference organized around the publication of the book by Walter Lippmann, where all those people who later on were going to contribute to neoliberalism appeared. So for various historical circumstances, neoliberalism developed with the Montpellier Society after the Second World War, but actually the seed of neoliberalism were sown before the war in Paris in 1938. Of course, the Second World War changed all that. And the way neoliberalism, and that's the first part. First, there is a tradition of economic liberalism in France and even neoliberalism. Second is that you find neoliberalism everywhere in France, meaning both on the left and on the right. And the way it connects with different political sides is through a specific ideology which is not exactly identical to neoliberalism, which has many common characteristics with neoliberalism, which is modernism. And it's an important thing for France because the story of France since the beginning of the 20th century, and even probably since the 1870 war and defeat against Prussia, is this obsession with making the country more modern. Okay? And this obsession with modernism is something which is an ideology which developed over the 20th century and which progressively dominated both on the left and on the right, and it's an ideology which is, and it's not simply an ideology, it's also carried by some interests, of course, but it's an idea that is irrigating, in a way, both the left and the right. Like, for instance, you've got interesting things. Everybody knows, or nearly everybody knows, that modernism was crucial to explain the development of post-war France, but it was present before the war, before the Second World War as well, and this is not well known. There is an excellent book by an American historian named Richard Keisel, which shows this very well. The influence of modernism in the interwar governance and this obsession to, because actually the French government realized that France was a backward country with respect, for instance, to the United States. And their obsession was to have France catching up with the US by means of modernizing the economy. And modernizing the economy did not mean simply to have more up-to-date equipment in factories. It also meant having more modern policies, having more modern social relations, etc., etc. So it was a change. It was really a wide-ranging social change. So I'm not going to. I haven't got time to explain all of it, but it's something which is very present during before the war and after the war, and even during the war. There's something. Something interesting that you had modernists both, so during the war France was occupied by Nazi Germany, and you had this collaborationist government in Vichy and a resistance government in London. And what is interesting is that you find modernist elements both in London and in Vichy. So neoliberalism, very shortly, neoliberalism is not something which should be mistaken for laissez-faire. Neoliberalism is something which explains that the market, competitive market, is something which is institutionalized, which has got to be created, etc., etc. So I'm not going to explain more in detail what is neoliberalism, but the main elements are explained there. So no natural character of the market order, competition as a central element, a role of the state, which is something that people sometimes misunderstand about neoliberalism. There's a role of the state, for the state in neoliberalism. This idea of a third way between central planning and laissez-faire, etc., etc. So neoliberalism in France. So why was so modernism is present both in the left and in the right, and it has connections with neoliberalism. What are the common elements between modernism and neoliberalism? A critique of laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is leading to an economic situation which is not desirable. Anti-Marxist. anti-socialist, even in anti, communism, central planning, etc. Pro-elitism. It's a society is going to be governed by the able, etc., which is something which is very present in the early neoliberal texts and in the modernist texts as well, etc. So, I mean, you've got common elements. Again, distinct ideologies, but with important common elements. So the way neoliberal ideas could diffuse through the policy-making circles in France is basically through modernism. Okay, and in Keisel's book, there is something interesting when he shows quite convincingly that the period which is called dirigisme, which means the post-war period in France, etc., is something which is a neoliberal order and not a statist order, or it is a statist order in a way, but it's a neoliberal statist order. Okay, so I've got to speed up because I'm probably taking too much time on this. Yeah, why? So, going forward in time and going back to the more recent period, since the 1970s and 1980s. So, crisis in the 1970s, slowdown in economic growth, increasing unemployment, etc., etc. At the same time, you've got this modernist ideology, which has been present in policymaking in France since the post-war, really. And the economic crisis in the 1970s created an opportunity for a change in policymaking in a neoliberal direction. And you've got some key figures which are important to explain this neoliberal turn. Valéry Giscard d'Estaing was president of France in the 1970s, is, to the best of my knowledge, the only leading politician, who claimed the label neoliberal. He said, I am neoliberal, and the policies I want to implement are neoliberal. So it's not, neoliberalism was not a swear word. It was a label which a dominant politician could actually claim for himself. And is extremely important in the diffusion of neoliberal ideas, also for historical reasons, but I'm not going to say that. That was on the right. And on the left, you've got other key people which explain the diffusion of neoliberal ideas, this time not claiming the title. It's, for instance, Jacques Delors. Jacques Delors, who was going to be the president of the European Commission, but before that, he was a Ministry of Finance in the left government of the early 1980s, is, of course, not claiming to be neoliberal, but is certainly claiming to be modernist. And, in fact, his modernism is very, very close to what we would call neoliberalism. The situation in France, end of the 1970s, end of the 1980s. So what takes place in the early 1980s, in 1981, you've got the political victory of the left, which is something which had not taken place for 23 years. So it means it's a radical change from a political point of view. And it is interesting that it is interpreted at the time by regulationists such as Alain Lipietz, for instance, as something which will create problem with finding a social support for the new policy. So Lipietz in 1984 is already saying there is a problem with the social base of the left. But he clearly misidentifies the problem. He finds the problem where there is no problem, but he doesn't see the problem where it is. So very schematically, you could say that the French situation at the beginning of the 1980s, end of the 1970s, you had two different social blocks. You had a left bloc and a right bloc. And they would be sociologically different. So you would have, the bulk of the working class was more on the left bloc. The public sector was more on the left bloc. The self-employed were in the right bloc. Part of the private sector, especially the skilled people, the private sector would be in the right bloc, etc., etc. So you would have two different blocks. Those two different blocks composed of different groups, which had, of course, different political and policy demands, which were, of course, different. And the situation is very clear at the beginning of the 1980s and the 1970s in France, because the left and right strategies were very different and very clear. The left strategy was Socialist Party in alliance with the Communist Party wanted to launch into a radical social democratic / socialist direction. They wanted to nationalize industries, they wanted to extend social protection, extend the protection on the labor market, and so on and so forth. So a typical left-wing policy. On the right had lost the election, and this is where Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan play a role. If they play a role, it's not a very important one. They've lost the election, and they were looking for a new direction in order to regain power. And they were looking in the US and in the UK and say, well, this radical neoliberalism, which is also part of our tradition, is also something which we could implement. And then the right had a political strategy to regain power, which was to implement a rather radical neoliberal direction. Okay. And the problem was that the two blocks, so it could have been, one block with another alternating in power with another. But of course, it was not a stable situation, because what took place is that the policies which were implemented led to a breakup of each block, of the two blocks. So you would have, for instance, in the right bloc, the right wanted to implement a radical neoliberal direction for France. The trouble is that within the right bloc, not everybody agreed. Part of the right bloc was not so keen on radical Thatcherism. So this created a tension within the right bloc. Within the left bloc, as you know, or as you may know, the socialists, when they came to power, they implemented a left-wing policy for about 6 months. And then, progressively, over a period of 1.5 years, they radically changed direction, and they implemented a policy which is more orthodox, so to speak. The traditional explanation is that, well, they implemented something, a left-wing policy. It didn't work because, the current account deficit was very important, so they resorted to having a more orthodox policy. This is only the tip of the iceberg, actually, because the real reason was that, from the beginning, a fraction of the left never wanted to have a radical left policy. A fraction of the Socialist Party never wanted the political alliance with the Communist Party. And when I said that Jacques Delors was a key figure in this, Jacques Delors actually, even before the victory of the left, had been in contact with employers' organizations to say, and basically he said to them, we are going to win the election. We are going to implement a policy which I don't like, which I don't approve. But don't worry, it's not going to last for very long. And within a few months, we are going to go back to a policy which suits better your own interests. I'm not making this up, actually. It's what the then president of the Employer Association said in his memoir. The thing is even within the left, you had a very strong fraction which was hostile to implementing a left policy. And they took the first opportunity, of course, to have a change of course in policy, which took place in 1983. But of course, the left had been elected by a social base which wanted a left economic policy. So they were not very happy with the policy that was being implemented. So part of the social bloc was okay with the change of policy, but another part of the left social bloc was definitely not okay with the policy that was being implemented. So that created, of course, a problem also for the left. So you see the left and right alliances, blocks, social blocks, are fragile and making more and more fragile as long as some policies are implemented. Got to speed up, haven't I? Because I'm taking really probably too much time. So the dilemmas, and this is a story which we could extend from the 1980s on until the most recent period. So the dilemmas of the left, for instance, was that it wanted to implement an economic policy which its own social support didn't want. Its own constituency didn't want this policy. So what they did was what I mentioned before. At first, they did not implement neoliberal reforms in the areas which were the most important for the left social bloc, in order not to lose the social support right away. Okay? Which is why what the left did when it was in power was to liberalize the financial sector. The most radical financial liberalization reforms in France were taken in the 1980s by a socialist government. They liberalized the product market, the Europe, the Jacques Delors, etc., etc. And with respect to social protection, they actually protected social protection, at least until the 1990s, and they protected the labor market as well. The right was a bit. The problem of the right was a bit different. The right, it was not as serious a problem in a way. The right had part of its constituency that wanted radical neoliberal reform, and the other part of the constituency which wanted reforms but not so radical. So the problem was a problem of finding the right balance between radical neoliberalization or moderate neoliberalization. So it's not as serious a problem as with the left. And the story of the right governments since the 1980s is a failure to find this right balance, attempts to find this right balance and a failure to find this right balance, which is why, for instance, the right was so fond of flexicurity, because it seemed like the magic formula which would preserve the right social bloc. You would have labor market flexibility. That would satisfy the radical core, neoliberal core of the right social bloc. But you would have some sort of social protection which would reassure the non-neoliberal core part of the right social bloc. Another issue, so this idea of neoliberalization is creating rifts in the dominance blocs in France. A related issue is one of European integration. I've got no time to explain in details how European integration is linked to neoliberalism. You could say, well, European integration is a neoliberal program in itself from the very beginning, etc., which has got some part of truth in it. It is linked to modernization very early on, especially for France, the idea that European integration would be a way to modernize France. Probably the best thing is summarized in those quotes. So in 1995, for instance, the Prime Minister Alain Juppé launched failed neoliberal reform of social protection, and it provoked a massive opposition in France, and it was justified by reference to the necessities of European monetary unification. So there's a clear link between welfare state retrenchment and the necessities of European monetary unification. A well-known neoliberal politician, right-wing politician, Alain Madelin, said he was in favor of Europe and European integration because, as he says, it would be a life insurance against socialism, which is actually what Hayek had said much earlier on. The president of the Employers Association, MEDEF, Ernest-Antoine Sellière, welcomed the European constraints because it would be a way to orient France in a direction which he found very interesting. Another important member of the Employers Association, Denis Kessler, a former member of the Socialist Party incidentally, said Europe is a machine to reform France against its will, right? So you've got this idea that you've got social resistance to the transformation of France into a neoliberal model. Europe is going to be instrumental in bringing out this transformation. And probably the clearest explanation was Jean Pisani-Ferry, who's actually the chief economic advisor of Macron during the campaign, when he said Europe was a structural adjustment program. You know, so Europe has done to France what the IMF does to developing countries. Okay. And even Schäuble, there is a conference, Wolfgang Schäuble a couple of years ago gave a conference at the Brookings Institution. It's on YouTube, it's a really funny thing to watch. When he says, when I talk with my friends, Emmanuel Macron, he tells me how difficult it is to reform France, but this is democracy, and democracy is difficult, etc. And he ends up by saying, maybe there should be a troika for France. You know, that's the idea. So you get the idea. Why the population in France make this association between neoliberal transformation and European integration. So the point I want to make is that both the left and the right have got the problems with their traditional social blocs, particularly the left. And the left wants to implement a policy which the traditional social alliance of the left doesn't want. So their problem is to find a new social alliance. And this new social alliance is going to be found by putting forward a dominant cleavage which will be around European integration. So instead of having an opposition, a traditional opposition between social democracy versus liberal right-wing economic policies, they would try to promote a cleavage, a dominant cleavage, which would be, are you in favor of European integration, or are you against European integration, populist, nationalists, etc., etc. With, in the package, of course, the idea that European integration means the neoliberal transformation of France. Okay. So this search, particularly on the left, but also on the right, this search for a new dominant social bloc. So situation of systemic crisis, political crisis. The dominant bloc has broken up, both on the left and on the right. We try to implement reforms to find a new dominant bloc. We can't find it. We're in a situation of systemic crisis. So it is a search for a new dominant social bloc, and this idea emerges slowly, but it's a very old idea to say we should go beyond the left-right opposition and try to find a new bloc, taking groups for the former left bloc and the former right bloc who would be in favor of European integration. Okay? And this bloc is identified more or less from a sociological point of view. It is the better off part of the private and the public sector, the most skilled part of the former right bloc and left bloc. Okay? And in a way, it's a problem of finding a new type of social compromise. The search for a new dominant social bloc, which would replace the former left and right blocs, the clearest, until Macron, the clearest political strategy was implemented by Hollande. So François Hollande was elected president in 2012. He was elected by the left bloc, and right away he implemented a policy which was geared towards finding a new social bloc, which would be the bloc I've described earlier on. Okay? So incidentally, my co-author Stefano Marini and I have called this new bloc the bloc bourgeois, which it's an expression which has different meanings in different countries, including this country. But the way we say it, so it's a bloc, or it should be a bloc, and it's bourgeois because it's a bloc characterized by the fact that there is no popular classes within this bloc. It's mostly middle and upper classes, if we want to talk in simple middle class, upper class terms. So Hollande definitely implemented that, and he failed. He failed probably because of political reasons, but he was the first president to break up with the traditional strategy of the left, which I had described, which is to say we neoliberalize everywhere except in the most important areas for the left social bloc. And the reason is simple. They've liberalized everything already. So if they want to go further, they've got to go in the direction of affecting the areas which were so far protected, meaning social protection and the labour market. So it's what he did. I mean, he was he launched actually towards the end of his presidency, he launched radical labour market reform, which provoked quite a substantial social opposition. And it's interesting to see that it is the most neoliberal reform ever implemented in France, even by a right-wing government. So, I mean, you've got this apparently bizarre situation when you've got a supposedly left government which liberalizes the labour market more radically than any right government has ever done in the past. And it's bizarre, except it is not when you think about the elements which I've mentioned and this change of strategy and its search for a new social bloc and actually leaving the traditional part of the social left-wing constituency. There is an interesting, even said something interesting, François Hollande. Even that was, I think, at the beginning of this presidency. He started to implement neoliberal reforms. I'm not going into these details, but I could if you wanted. And a journalist asks him and says, "But you're going to lose the support of the population." And the answer to the journalist is, yeah, the working class, but it doesn't matter. Okay, so I don't care if I lose the support of the blue collars, of the working class. So it was very clearly, I'm looking for something different there. He never found it, but he paved the way for someone who was going to go in the same direction, but in more radically even, which was, who was, of course, Emmanuel Macron. Okay, so going back to the problem of the social alliance, it's in a way it's a problem that was identified by the theory of regulation. Alain Lippietz has got this sentence to describe Fordism in a couple of words. He said Fordism was an alliance between a fraction of capital and the wage earners. And you could say that the current situation is more like a social compromise, a socio-political compromise between capital and a fraction of wage earners, a fraction of the wage earners. The more educated, the more skilled, etc., etc. And the point is that it is characterized, I mean, modern capitalism, modern neoliberal capitalism is characterized by segmentation, precariousness for some parts of the wage-earning class. Inequalities, documented by Piketty and many others, etc. And it is generally interpreted as something which is an unfortunate side effect. You know, oh, it's terrible. We neoliberalize and we've got a rise in inequalities. Oh, we've got a rise in precariousness, etc., etc. A thing which I think is missed by the analysts of capitalism which look at those phenomena as unfortunate side effects is that, in fact, they're functionally essential to the transformation of capitalism. If you think that the new regime is going to be based on a new social bloc, the bloc bourgeois, then increasing inequalities, increasing precariousness for a part of the population, there are essential components for the emergence of the new regime. Because you've got to, of course, the former blocks are broken up, but not completely. So in order to break them up completely, you need to increase differentiation. You need to increase segmentation. I mean, the former left bloc, for instance, was an alliance between the educated middle class and the working class. In order to cut the links, the solidarities between the educated middle class and the working classes, you need to increase segmentation. You need to increase inequalities. Again, I'm not saying it's a master plan. I'm just saying that from the point of view of the system, it's absolutely essential that you've got a rise in inequalities, because this rise in inequalities, etc., inequalities in income, inequalities in statuses, etc., are actually functionally essential to the breakup of the former blocks and the emergence of a new bloc. Again, to see that it's an old problem, there is a book on the economic history of France written by André Goron in 2 volumes. And in the second volume, when he talks about the modernists, you know, the people I've talked about earlier on, he says that the modernists have never paid attention to the working class because the working class was alien to them. So, I mean, and he makes a reference to the Mendicist period, meaning actually the period in the 1950s in France. So you can see that, again, it is both a current evolution and an old problem which has been within France at least since the 1950s and probably since the 1930s. So it's not like something which emerged radically in the 1980s. It's probably a very old problem, which, as old as neoliberalism, for instance, and neoliberalism is like 70 or 80 years old. Yeah, I'm going to conclude about Macron. So Macron won. Macron's victory is both exceptional and not surprising. It is exceptional because he'd never been elected before. And as you know, the president in France has got more power than, you know, the prime minister in England or the chancellor in Germany. So it's quite an important position. He'd never been elected in anything before, except maybe a class representative when he was young or whatever. I mean, he's a pure technocrat. He came out of nowhere, except not exactly out of nowhere, which is the not exceptional part. That he was, in a way, was created by François Hollande. So François Hollande created a creature which killed him, which is something which happens quite often in the political life. And in a way, he made possible what was not possible for Hollande, who was probably too much associated with the Socialist Party, and he was not the right man to actually take this change of political and social strategy and economic strategy to the end. So that it needed probably a new man in order to do that. So anyway, Emmanuel Macron won the election claiming to be neither left nor right, or alternatively claiming to be both left and right. So very clearly he was beyond the left-right cleavage. And the main orientations of his economic policy were European integration and reforms, meaning neoliberal reforms. And the social bloc he wanted to base his political strategy and economic strategy on was clearly the bloc bourgeois. So he achieved, he succeeded what the Socialist Party had failed for many decades. And even the right parties, the conservative parties wanted to do it, but probably failed to do it not for structural reasons, but probably for reasons which have got to do with chance more than structural reasons. Probably the right wing could have done it, could have won with a more moderate candidate than the one they chose in the end, but they didn't do it. So Macron was really lucky, and he emerged, and he incarnates to the perfection this bloc bourgeois strategy and this pro-European integration, pro-neoliberal reform, etc. But is the bloc bourgeois a stable, dominant social bloc? I don't think so. And for reasons, because Macron succeeded for reasons which are reasons attached to the peculiarities of the French political system, meaning the presidential election. So Macron won the presidential election, being elected by a very narrow fraction of the French population. But because of this two-round system, in fact, it was absolutely certain that Marine Le Pen would be in the second round. So whoever was opposed to Marine Le Pen in the second round was certain to win. Okay, so he could win, and he got 24% in the first round of the election. So he was, it's not something. If the French system had been like the German system, for instance, he would never have a majority. He would have to have a coalition with different parties, both from the left and from the right, and he would not have this sort of concentration of power on his own persona, which is possible because of peculiarities of the French presidential system. But the bloc bourgeois is very limited, because if you take the core of the bloc bourgeois, the most educated fraction of the middle and the upper classes, I mean, at most it's between 10 and 20% of the electorate. So you can't have a stable dominant social bloc with such a narrow social base. So you would need to extend this narrow core beyond the strict bloc bourgeois. And in a recent paper, I've shown that the only possibility for him to do that was actually to extend in the direction of the traditional right-wing groups, the blocs, the groups which were part of the right blocs. The problem being, of course, that the more you extend your social base, the more you've got to compromise on some issues, and the more it is difficult to find the dominant political strategy which keeps the bloc united together. And again, he's very lucky because for the moment, he can do whatever he wants for 5 years. He hasn't got to find compromises with other groups, with other political parties, as he would have to, for instance, as if it were the German political system, which is dominant in France. So he can do whatever he wants. But the problem of the narrowness of the bloc bourgeois is still there. So Macron's presidency, very clearly a neoliberal transformation of the French model. And European integration, it's interesting that the way Macron is perceived, I think, in other countries is, he's the one who is going to save the European Union, etc., etc. And what people fail to see is that European integration, in France, as in any other country, is a problem of national politics. So Macron is pro-European integration for reasons which are entirely French political reasons. Because European integration is a way to consolidate the bloc bourgeois. Okay? So I mean, if he wouldn't be pro-European integration if European integration was a hindrance to the emergence of the bloc bourgeois. Okay? So again, it's a problem, but pro-European Macron is not pro-European, he's pro-European for good, rational political reasons. A contradiction within the bloc bourgeois itself to say, is it a stable configuration? What is called modernization of the French economic model is actually increased financialization of the French economic model. The macroeconomic stability, as it's been discussed in many contributions, the macroeconomic stability of this regime is questionable. So that actually raises the issue of, is it possible to have a stable macroeconomic regime with the pursuit of financialization? And the answer is, well, maybe not. Which is a problem, of course, for the stability of Macron's strategy. Narrowness of the bloc bourgeois, I've talked about it. The ambivalence of inequality. As I've said, inequality is functionally, the increase in inequality is functionally essential to the emergence of the bloc bourgeois. But it also is a potential threat to the stability of the bloc bourgeois. Because if you increase inequalities so as to have a phenomenon such as the disappearance of the middle class, it is of course a problem for the existence of a bloc bourgeois. So if you go beyond a certain level of inequalities and you reach a level where you've got a society with a massive bulk of the population too poor to be considered as middle class and to consider itself as middle class, and another part of the population which is too rich to be considered to be middle class. So, you know, the situation which everybody's saying is taking place in the US at the moment. So if this takes place, of course, this is a crucial threat to the simple existence of the bloc bourgeois. So inequality, both in income and in statuses, is both essential for the emergence of the bloc bourgeois as a stable, dominant social bloc, and a threat for the existence of this bloc bourgeois. So you've got a contradiction within this political strategy of the bloc bourgeois, and probably the development of this contradiction in the future are going to ensure that the systemic crisis that characterizes France since the 1980s is probably going to endure. At least that's the prediction I would make based on the elements that I've presented. And I'll stop here. I've been too long already.
I was wondering in how far he and his bases fit into the current configuration of French politics. So yeah, that's a very specific question. And then the other one concerns the alliances between what you say, the educated middle class and the working class. And there are two big policy areas that come to mind where I see that there is a confrontation or between the two classes and a problem for them coming together in alliance, and this is climate and migration. And I feel like, in a sense, in the left, there is a concern for working class issues, but then there also is a concern, well, of an international working class or international justice, and this is key when it comes to, well, climate, ecological question, as well as to open borders. And I'm wondering, do you see any potential of overcoming these barriers of the educated middle class and the working class coming together on these two issues?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I'm going to just to make things clearer. I'm going to make this diagram. I don't want to imply that the political space is two-dimensional. It's just a projection. Okay? There are more dimensions than just two. But I want to make this projection on two dimensions because I hate this dominant political science, two-dimensional, cultural versus economic, etc. I hate that. And I don't want this to be mistaken for that. This being said, let's say you've got the economic dimension where you've got, let's say, right and left. Right is on the left, right. Let's say right economic, left economic, and you've got European integration. Okay, and you've got pro-European integration, and you've got anti-European integration. The idea of the bloc bourgeois is to be located here. Or even here, Okay, that's the bloc bourgeois. The traditional left and right blocks would be somewhere here. Okay. So what the Macron strategy is doing is to say we leave the working classes, both of the left, right, and the right, of the left bloc and the right bloc are here. Okay, they're usually not so fond of European integration, etc. So Macron would be here. Mélenchon would be here. And Marine Le Pen, the former Front National, Rassemblement National, the far right would be here. Okay. And the problem is, the question we asked Stefano Marini and I in the book published last year is to say, if there is a bloc bourgeois which is stabilized, is there a possibility for an anti-bourgeois bloc to emerge, which would be trying to unite these segments of the former blocs? The problem is they agree on next to nothing. Okay, so it is.
Exactly.
Yeah, and even there, it's so the idea of Europe. Okay, the idea of Europe, they're dissatisfied with respect to Europe, but for different reasons. It means it's more a unity in rejection of European integration as it is than the unity in an alternative European project. So the problem is that the strategy of uniting these segments is the fact that basically you can't find a political mediation which would unite those groups. Okay? So that would leave more than a bipolar partition of the political space, more like some sort of tripolar thing. So that would, and actually going back to Mélenchon, you can see the hesitations in his strategy, which was trying to reunite the left bloc, but then you've got the problem with European integration, or trying to find a more populist bloc, but then you've got the problem of everything there, including migrants, etc. So that's why we were so pessimistic in our. Maybe just one thing is a possible way out for the left would be precisely to play on this idea of hierarchy and to say, okay, you've got some people there which are hostile to migrants, hostile to climate, etc., etc. But there might be a situation where actually the economic policy preferences are going to matter more than migrants, more than the opposition to their environmental policies and so on and so forth. So the possibility would be more dynamic to have part of these people to actually move in that direction, precisely because the increase in inequality would actually make them more sympathetic towards redistribution policies, social protection policies, etc. And then the problem would not be to say, you've got to stop being racist. Okay, you can stay racist if you want, as long as you don't want a racist policy being implemented. Be racist when you talk to each other in the evening, but if you don't want a racist policy, it's okay. You can have the economic policy you would want to have. So that would be sort of an alternative populist strategy, which is to say that we can win some groups over by hoping that and implementing strategies that would make the economic policy demands more important than the rest. But it's probably a difficult possibility as well. You organize it.
Yes.
You should.
No, there was this quote that I saw in the slide. It was like a whole slide of quotes regarding 80s or 90s of person. Yeah, go. From 1988 to, let me guess it. I don't know who he is, but if it could be some context, is it from the working class?
No.
Oh, okay.
No,
Yeah,
no, no.
So the issue is that in all this analysis, you identify what the bourgeois is and everything, but what is the working class? Because statistically, the working class in France are black nurses. And every definition that we use, and when we imagine in our collective imagination of the working class, they're white French men who don't believe in European integration and so on. Does your definition of the working class deviate from the mainstream definition of the working class, or even when your analysis, you're still thinking of what people direct to as the working class? And she has to
on this, for instance, I mean, implied indirectly that the high skill services employees are ecologist women. Like, I mean, it's not only him, but like I think this kind of discourse on the right is people debate in politics as if ecology, feminism was high skill bourgeois values, and like I don't know this guy, so who is it?
Who is it? Yeah, I can tell you who he is. He was economic advisor to the Socialist Minister of Finance in the early 1980s and early 1980s. He's an economist, and I would say he's a traditional Socialist Party economist. That's why he is. He writes in the 1980s, which is why his view of the environment problem is like a bit of a luxury. which is something that most left-wing people, and probably most people nowadays, wouldn't see that as a luxury, more as something which is, extremely important. The way to understand this quote is not to say that it's the strategy of the modernists, saying the modernists have got this view of the economy which is right-wing, let's say in blunt terms, and then in order to appear left-wing, they would insist or over-insist on non-economic part of the left-wing program, which is why he mentions these, feminist, autonomist, ecologist, etc., etc. To overemphasize on this part in order to conceal the fact that actually on the rest of the issues they're pretty much right-wing. It's not to say, or at least I don't think it should be interpreted that way, it's not to say that, of course, we should disregard feminist, autonomist, ecologist preoccupations and so on. And what to say that, I mean, even, every right-wing socialist, if you see what I mean, every right-wing socialist did that until Macron. Macron didn't do that. Every right-wing socialist did that to insist on the fact that they would be pro-gender equality, everything which would be positive, they would insist that they would be pro that in order to not to talk about the sensitive issues. Let me give you an example. When Dominique Strauss-Kahn was still present in the French political life, there was a part of the there was a part, I can't remember exactly when, but part of the debate where the question of a left-wing economic policy cropped up again in the debates around, in the French political debate. Probably I think it was before a European election or something like this. And in order to have this debate not engage in that direction, I can remember very clearly Strauss-Kahn making a declaration apropos of nothing, because nobody had asked him the question, saying, I'm very much in favor of the marriage for everybody, including gay people, etc. Nobody had asked him the question, but it's, putting this issue forward in order not to talk about the economic issue.
So you're saying Macron didn't do that? Macron explicitly did that?
No, Macron sent every sign to quite the opposite, to the traditional Catholic right wing. Yeah.
Well, in terms of gender equality, no.
Yeah, but this is neoliberal. This is in favor of equality because he's in favor of competition, so gender equality, etc., etc. But I mean, there is something which has been not noticed enough, is the fact that he made a visit to a very traditional right-wing Catholic traditionalist before the election, sending a sign in the direction of this traditional Catholic, very conservative electorate of France, saying that he would not... and regarding the mariage pour tous, this marriage being open to gays, which is probably the only left-wing measure of Hollande, he was very reserved on this issue. And he sent signals saying that, as you may know, so marriage is authorized for same-sex persons in France since Hollande, since 2012, 2013. There was a massive opposition to that. It's very surprising. It's a part of France that you don't know exists, but exists. You've got all those people from the traditional Catholic fractions which manifested, which demonstrated against this, as if, I don't know, I mean, they manifested as strongly as if you'd taken half their wealth or something. And this lasted for, I don't know, weeks, months, until they got bored with it. So there was a very strong opposition. And Macron, in spite of what you say about gender equality, about, let's say, cultural liberalism, Macron sent signals towards this front saying that those people had not been respected enough. Those people that demonstrated against the gay marriage had not been respected enough. Okay? So that's a very clear sign towards this very traditional Catholic fraction of the electorate. And my working class is men, women. No, in the analysis, the working class is as diverse as the rest of the French population, and the working class is characterized by, it is not so much in favor of European integration, etc. I mean, yeah.
On the first part of the organization and the framework, so I mean, we know that policymakers have also, I mean, they're part of society, so they integrated some theory and vision about what they should do and so on. So from the analysis among classes, I think that, I mean, that even right-wing people might have put it this way. But do you think, or do you see some people in policy making using indirectly your kind of framework with like hierarchy institutions, social basis, or do you think it's something that they could use as a tool to understand things, or do they do it like naturally without saying that just because they're doing the material interest? Does it make sense? And then the second question is like, for instance, if I were an advisor of Macron, like what, using your framework about like social alliances, the illusion of the bloc bourgeois, how would they run for the next election to find the basis?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it is, of course, an analysis from the outside and not from the inside. But sometimes when I read some declarations by politicians, I've got the impression that I've written them because they're using exactly the same categories, etc. So I do think that even when they do not use exactly the same framework, I mean, this framework is somewhere in the back of their head, and they definitely think in terms of finding the right social support, etc., etc. And my advice to Macron. I would say to play the European integration as much as he can. Play this card, this European integration card as much as he can, probably.
What's your advice to Mélenchon?
To insist on the economic dimension, on the economic issues. Everywhere in Europe, in France, but also in Germany, there is a problem for the left-wing parties, which is this question of migration. And I think it would be wise for the left wing not to insist too much on that. Not meaning compromising on policies, but not have that emerge as a dominant divide. Yeah. From that point of view, I was thinking from this point of view.
No, I'm talking about your position here. So,
but I mean, the Lega and 5 Star is the exact opposite of what Mélenchon wanted to do. Is that the Lega 5 Star is an alliance dominated by a far right movement, the Lega,
yes.
and the idea, the strategy of Mélenchon would have the populist movement dominated by the left and insisting on left issues.
This is, but I'm talking about, you said the impossible, where it's impossible to link the left anti-European party and the right anti-European party, but
yeah,
this is what happened.
Yeah, but what are the left policies of the current Italian government?
Well, they actually made the first reform that strengthened a little bit the protection of labor. It's the first reform in that direction. It's very weak.
I'm not an expert on Italy, my co-author is, but it doesn't seem to me that there is much left. I mean, this this improvement is. Yeah.
I'm saying that they made the first non-neoliberal reform on labor rights in 20 years in Italy. It's a very weak, but it has been a strong signal. And it has been the left wing, the opposition left, has not been able to criticize it, because if they were criticizing it, they were siding with the association manufacturers, and then that would be quite difficult to do. So the recent reform on the labor rights. Well, there's the same for. They have improved the situation of precarious workers a little bit, so they have limited the possibility of use the very precarious and bad contracts for workers. They have raised the amount of money that these workers receive if they are fired, and so on. It's a small change.
So, yeah, it's more fine-tuning neoliberalization.
Well, I'm not saying it's the revolution.
No, well, I mean, even Macron could do a thing like this.
No, Macron is not doing any of that.
No, he's not doing any of that. But I mean, let's imagine he goes too far. I can imagine him going backwards a bit before the next election. I can imagine him doing that.
The point is, if we're saying that this is just an instrumental thing, because in fact they are neoliberal, okay, but they seem not to be neoliberal. And if we have to stay on what they say they are not, and what they do so far they have not been. If we want to classify them as neoliberal just because we want to, that's fine. And if we want to say they will definitely go for strongly neoliberal policies, we can see that it's going to happen. But so far it has not.
No, it's different because the previous governments have gone so far. Actually, I mean, it's a bit like Merkel and the Hartz IV. Like when Merkel first came to power, they went a bit backwards regarding Hartz IV because the previous governments had gone so far that it was a conservative government that could actually improve a bit the situation. But it's not changing the situation radically. I mean, it is this, if I'm not mistaken, I'm talking with control, it's this Article 18, okay, thing. It's not being reinstated, has it?
No, of course not, but Article 18 has been taken out from the left party.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, and you can see that the problem there, right?
No, the point is that I don't think that, first, I don't think the alliance is stable in Italy, but I'm not a specialist in Italy. And it is more an alliance from this point of view, meaning having the economic aspects as marginal as possible and insisting on all the other aspects, migrants, whatever, etc., which is not the strategy that would be implemented from that point of view, which would be exactly the opposite.
I mean, I guess we're going to see, since the government is not really in charge for a short time, but right now the big fight is going to happen is with the European budget, and the other one is the reform of the welfare system for the unemployed, and the fights that movements want to move toward a basic income policy. And I mean, all of these things can skew the issue. So far, there's been mostly media battles on the racism issue and immigrants issue. That's not that into, like on macro policy, not so much.
Not to be mistaken, I'm not saying that it cannot work, whatever the contexts, country, etc. When I was saying that it's probably not possible, I was talking about France. I'm saying that maybe it is, I'm not a specialist of, I don't know, Hungary or Poland. It might be that you've got some sort of alliance there in Hungary, which is actually, seems to be stable and orienting. You know, in the new edition of the book, there is this 3-strategy table where you've got 3 different models, the neoliberal ones, the socialist, social democratic one, and what I call nationalist welfare state one. Okay. So it seems like there would be a possibility for around those issues. What I'm saying is that, and this is particular to France, I don't know how it applies to other countries, but within the constituency of the far right in France, you've got a fraction which is radically neoliberal and a fraction which is radically anti-neoliberal. So it is a problem even within the National Front, or the Rassemblement National as it's called nowadays, to actually find a dominant political strategy that could not only find a stable dominant bloc, but even its own constituency has to be actually united around these issues, and it's not simple. Might be different in other countries. Yeah.
Could you elaborate as to how European federalism and EU stability fund proposals serve a domestic audience?
No, it is the issue. The problem for Macron was stabilizing the Eurozone because of the Euro crisis. It's the traditional debate in economics, like we haven't got, we would need fiscal federalism, we would need, etc., etc.
So it's all about maintaining an artificially low euro?
No, it's about maintaining the Eurozone in existence, because its very existence is threatened by those deficiencies. And the Eurozone in particular, and the whole European integration project in general, is essential to the domestic political strategy of Macron. Which is why I'm saying that he is in favor of European integration for domestic reasons.
Wouldn't the implementation of those proposals require sort of like ballooning of budget deficits that the alternative parts of this program would seem to suggest that they're going to try to contract?
No, it would be more like, it's a difficult, probably an impossible bargaining with Germany anyway. It would more imply, it would be more instrumental to the dismantling of the welfare state actually, because the fiscal capacity would be concentrated at the European level, okay? Meaning that it would be more in the direction of infrastructural investment, etc., and not in the direction of social protection or other interventions of the welfare state. So it could be very instrumental in implementing a budget policy which would be entirely neoliberal. So I think it is another reason why they're in favour of it. Because you've got a whole European literature on making public expenditure efficient, etc. And what they mean is actually making public expenditures go into the private sector in order to foster their activity, instead of paying people unemployment benefits. We've got to organize this one.
Short question to you. I was wondering about the framing of this modernist neoliberal view. I mean, how has this evolved maybe also during this time, and how maybe also were there different fractions of capital that had a different interpretation of the concrete framing of this policy, especially like the relation with the more order-liberal tradition in Germany, where there are some fractions, for example, in capital in France that try to frame this modernist perspective rather in this direction, or could you explain a little bit more about this?
It is, as I said, it was modernization both in economic policy, intervention of the state, etc., and in social relations. So it's different from order liberalism, which is more having a set of rules to organize a fair competition and so on and so forth. In order to understand that, we've got to take into consideration the respective positions of France and Germany, especially around the Second World War period. The problem of France was to catch up with other industrialized countries, which was less the problem of Germany at the time. So, and this idea that if it's not organized by rational technocracy, it is not going to work because previous historical experiences, etc. Which is why the technocracy, and particularly the public technocracy, was given such an importance in France and not in other countries, certainly not in Germany, for example. And if, again, more details, it would be too long to explain, but if I want to cut a very long story short, is to say that modernism included, at the time around the Second World War and post-Second World War, included some ideas of neoliberalism, like the importance of the market or the regulated market, etc., and some socially progressive ideas, because at the time, modernizing social relations implied ditching this traditional paternalistic model of social relations which was dominant in traditional French culture. But as the economy modernized, this social progressivism part vanished, okay? Because, you know, in the 1970s and 1980s, modernizing social relations meant increasingly, you know, well, flexibilizing the labor markets, getting rid of rigidities, and so on and so forth. So the story of modernism in the post-World War, from the end of the Second World War until the most recent period, is the story of the modernists ditching the socially progressive part and being more and more neoliberal in a way. I mean, if you're familiar with French political life, I mean, I can incarnate this idea that modernism immediately after the Second World War was Pierre Mendès France, a socialist deputy, shortly prime minister, etc. Then you've got the first degeneracy into Rocard and Delors, and a second degeneracy of Delors and Rocard into Macron. Okay? That's modernism. So if you compare Macron to Mendès France, you've got, you know, I don't know what one would have said to the other, you know, they would, especially in terms of being socially progressive. Just an example, for instance, Mendès France was in favor of European integration, but he wanted a European integration on socially advanced levels. So he was opposed, for instance, to the freedom of capital movements. Okay? And Delors, who is often presented as a political heir to Mendès France, the first measure, important measure he took when he was president of the European Commission, was to make it possible for capital movements to be free, not only within Europe, but between Europe and the rest of the world. So it's a perfect illustration of the degeneracy of modernism into pure and simple neoliberalism. You raised.
Again, there's someone else.
No,
Okay.
last question.
Cool. So I think coming back again to what you said could be a best strategy and just emphasizing the economic policy and the progressive distributional issues. I'm wondering, and I find it really striking, why does the left not in general manage to do that much better and like mobilize this aspect of their policies and thereby really be attractive for the working class? What's the left doing wrong in order not to make this their strength and thereby become attractive? And then what I see in the UK at the moment is that actually the Corbyn left Labour, they propose this economic, like kind of progressive economic policy program. And I find it really exciting to see that. And so I don't know if you have looked into the UK, but I would be curious to hear what you think about the potential of the Labour left and the Corbyn.
I've lost familiarity with the UK for several decades. So I haven't followed actually the UK recently. I'm more tuned to Germany these days. Yeah, why? For France, I can give you an answer for France. Why it is not able to so much? It is partly because of the internal competition within the left. Parts of the left who would want, for instance, to be in competition with, for instance, Mélenchon or people like that, are insisting on other aspects than the strictly economic ones in order to differentiate themselves. So they've got an interest in putting the other issues forward. which is what you've got the funny situation of, as you know, the Socialist Party is virtually non-existent in France. But what remains of the Socialist Party is insisting on, at the moment, on the dangers of nationalism on the left, meaning Mélenchon, on the dangers of racism, on the dangers of etc., and they're putting forward a strongly anti-nationalist rhetoric in order to push themselves forward as being different from Mélenchon and being better than Mélenchon, etc. Because obviously on the economic issues, they have got nothing to compete with. And this, of course, creates a certain forum for those other ideas which are detrimental to the left in general, I think, and which are perfectly suited to the strategy of Macron, who wants to put forward this European integration versus non-European integration, mistaken for non-racist versus pro-racist type of issue. So that explains also why it is difficult sometimes to concentrate on the economic issues, although it is obviously the big spot of the Macron strategy. There's something I haven't followed, and I would be asking you a question, which is, what is this business with the supposed anti-Semitism of the Labour Party and Corbyn? It seems to me like, something which is bizarre and something which is maybe roughly similar to the things I was mentioning when you've got other parts of the left which try to put forward some of the purity to conceal their past sins regarding economic policy.
We started Chinese late, but I want to join with a question. So, do you see the similarities between the failures of the left and the failures of heterodox economics?
Yes, well, it's complicated. Again, for France, I've got regulation first. Regulation was too close, and it's a general. I end up with as an old man giving advice to people, stay as far as possible from politicians and stay as far as possible from the power in government. Because it's probably a failure of regulation to have been too close to the Socialist Party in the 1980s and thinking that they could influence economic policy, which they did not. And in the end, I think they lost part of their soul in the process. If you see Aguilera, for instance, Aguilera, the founding father of regulation, I was saying that to Cedric yesterday. If you read, so he's got his masterpiece, which is his first book on the US. In the French edition, the second edition, in 1982, you got a foreword. And it is one of the most interesting texts I can imagine to read, which is very clearly Marxist influenced, but modern Marxist influenced methodological. And then you've got the third edition of the book, and you've got, which is it's not a foreword, it's something else, maybe a post an afterword, in 1997. And you read this, and you're thinking you're reading something written by the eyes of Tony Blair. And you ask yourself, what happened during those 15 years which turned Michel Aguilera, one of the most brilliant minds in French economics, into some sort of talented third way advisor. And I think it's the proximity to power, although he was not that close to power, but it's the proximity to the government, and this idea that the economist has got to give advice to those who are in command of the economy, etc. He implies compromises. Compromises are the basics of political life, but they're detrimental to sound intellectual life. So that explains part of the decline of the total economy.
Thank you.